market from her. Not competitors. Not banks that once slammed doors in her face. Not even the people closest to her. She learned early that silence was a kind of armor, and she wore it every single day, even at home, even in bed next to the man she married before she had a single dollar to her name. What she never learned, what she could not have prepared for, was that the danger she needed armor against was already living under her own roof, sitting across from her at breakfast, smiling at her in photographs that would later be studied by millions of strangers. Daniel Calloway was there before the money. He was there when Margaret slept 4 hours a night and ate cold takeout standing up in a rented office with a leaking ceiling. He held her hand at her father's funeral and again at the hospital when doctors told her the exhaustion had finally caught up to her body. For a long time he was simply her husband, and that word was enough for him. But somewhere in the climb from nothing to $85 billion, being simply her husband stopped feeling like enough. Nobody noticed the exact moment it happened. Not Margaret, not their friends. Only Daniel knew, and he kept that knowledge to himself the way a man keeps a splinter he has decided not to remove. 18 years ago, Daniel made a decision that would sit quietly in the dark for nearly 2 decades. Her name was Vanessa Cole, and what began as something he told himself meant nothing became a son named Ethan, born the same year Margaret's company signed its first billion-dollar contract. While the world celebrated Margaret Calloway's rise, Daniel was arranging quiet transfers, private schools 3 states away, and a story for Ethan to repeat if anyone ever asked who his father was. The boy grew up believing his father simply traveled often for work. He was taught, gently but firmly, that some things were not to be spoken about outside their small house. He never once set foot inside the world his father actually belonged to. Margaret's world, the one everyone could see, kept expanding. Magazine covers, boardrooms, a foundation with her name on it, and finally, an invitation that felt like the summit of everything she had built alone, bruised knuckles and all. Forbes was preparing to name her among its billionaires for the very first time, and the ceremony would not be some quiet paperwork announcement. It would be televised, celebrated, filmed from every angle, attended by people who once doubted her and now wanted photographs beside her. She spent weeks preparing her speech. She wanted it to honor the years nobody saw, the version of her that scrubbed floors before she ever signed a contract worth scrubbing floors for. She had no idea that Daniel had also been preparing something. Not a toast, not a tribute, something else entirely, something he had been rehearsing quietly for longer than she could imagine. Timed for the one night he knew every camera in the room would already be pointed directly at her. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. On the night of the ceremony, Margaret walked onto that stage believing this was the proudest moment of her life. She had rehearsed gratitude. She had rehearsed humility. She had not rehearsed for a teenage boy standing quietly near the back of the room. A boy she had never met, wearing a face that, if she had looked closely enough, carried traces of a man she had shared a bed with for over 2 decades. She had not rehearsed for what Daniel was about to say into a microphone in front of every camera she had ever trusted to tell her story fairly. By the time he finished speaking, the room had gone still in a way that ballrooms rarely go still, the kind of silence that only happens when several hundred people realize all at once that they are witnessing something that was never meant to be witnessed by anyone. Margaret's face, frozen mid-sentence, would end up replayed more times in the following weeks than almost any other image that year. What Daniel revealed that night, and what he demanded in front of everyone she respected, would not simply humiliate her. It would force her to ask questions about her marriage, her company, and her own son that she never imagined she would need to ask. And by the end of this story, you will understand exactly why she never saw it coming, and exactly why he believed, after 18 years of silence, that this was the only night it could ever come out. To understand how a marriage of over 2 decades could collapse in front of a live audience, you first have to understand 3 people who almost never appeared in the same sentence until that night. Margaret Calloway, the woman who built a fortune most people cannot picture accurately even when the number is printed in front of them. Daniel Calloway, the husband who spent nearly 20 years being introduced simply as her +1. And Ethan Cole, an 18-year-old boy who, until that ceremony, had no idea his own existence would one day be announced to a room full of strangers holding champagne glasses. There are 3 questions this story will answer, and each answer is more complicated than it first appears. How does a man hide an entire second life from a woman whose entire career depends on knowing things other people miss? Why would he choose the single most public night of her life to reveal a secret he had protected for 18 years? And finally, what did Ethan actually want the moment his father pulled him into a spotlight he never asked to stand in? Was it recognition? Was it money? Or was it something far simpler, something almost nobody in that room considered until much later? Long before anyone photographed Margaret Calloway on a red carpet, she was a young woman working 2 jobs and sleeping in her car for stretches at a time, refusing to call her parents for help because she had promised herself she would build something entirely her own. She pitched her first idea to 11 investors before anyone said yes, and even that first yes came with conditions that would have discouraged most people from continuing. She continued anyway. She learned to read a room of skeptical men twice her age and speak in a way that made her impossible to dismiss, not because she raised her voice, but because she never needed to. By the time she was 30, Margaret had turned a small idea into a company worth watching. By 40, she had turned that company into one of the most recognized names in her industry. She rarely spoke publicly about the years before the success, the ones where she ate the same meal 5 nights in a row because it was the only thing she could afford in bulk. She preferred people to know her by what she built, not by what she survived to build it. That instinct for privacy, the same instinct that made her formidable in business, would later become the exact reason she missed what was happening inside her own home. Daniel entered her life before any of the success arrived, back when Margaret was simply a determined young woman with more ambition than money. He was steady where she was intense, quiet where she was direct, and for years that balance seemed to work. He managed the house. He handled the parts of life she had no time for. In the earliest interviews about her success, she used to credit him publicly, calling him the reason she could focus so completely on her company without worrying about anything else falling apart at home. But success has a way of rearranging a household, even when nobody intends it to. As Margaret's name grew louder in boardrooms, Daniel's name grew quieter in every room they entered together. At industry events, people shook his hand out of politeness and then turned immediately back to her. Reporters asked him what it felt like to be married to someone so successful, a question that sounds like a compliment until you have been asked it enough times to hear what it actually implies. Daniel began attending fewer events. He told Margaret he simply preferred staying home. She believed him because she trusted him, and because she was already thinking about the next deal before he finished the sentence. Vanessa Cole worked in an industry entirely separate from Margaret's world, and that distance was part of what made her feel, to Daniel, like a version of life that belonged only to him. Their relationship began quietly and stayed that way for years, hidden behind business trips that were sometimes real and sometimes invented entirely for the purpose of buying time. When Vanessa told Daniel she was pregnant, he did not respond with panic, at least not the kind people usually imagine. He responded with planning, private arrangements, a separate address, a story simple enough for a child to repeat without ever suspecting it was incomplete. Ethan grew up in a quiet house 3 states away from the one his father shared with Margaret, believing his father simply worked long hours in an industry that kept him traveling. He was a thoughtful, observant boy, the kind who noticed more than adults gave him credit for, but even he could not have guessed the truth because the truth had been constructed so carefully around him. There was one earlier moment, years before the ceremony, when a distant relative nearly said too much at a family gathering, and Daniel spent weeks afterward making sure no one repeated the mistake. For 18 years, the arrangement held. And then an invitation arrived, addressed to Margaret Calloway, informing her that Forbes intended to name her among the wealthiest self-made women in the country. And Daniel understood immediately that the quiet arrangement he had protected for so long was about to run out of time. The morning of the ceremony, Margaret woke up early, the way she always did before something important, and reviewed her speech one final time at the kitchen table. She had written and rewritten it for weeks, trying to find the right balance between gratitude and honesty, wanting to acknowledge the exhaustion of the climb without sounding as though she were complaining about a life most people would trade anything to have. Daniel was unusually calm that morning, calmer than she remembered him being before any event in recent memory. She noticed it briefly and decided it meant he was finally proud of her without reservation. She had no way of knowing it meant something else entirely. Across town, Ethan Cole put on a suit his father had bought him for the occasion, still unsure exactly why his father wanted him there or who any of these people were. Daniel had told him only that tonight was important, that he needed to trust him, and that whatever happened, Ethan should stay close to the stage. Ethan, who had spent 18 years trusting his father's version of the truth without question, agreed without asking for more detail, because that had always been the pattern between them. The ballroom that evening was filled with the kind of polished attention reserved for people the room considers important. Margaret took the stage to applause that felt, to her, like the closing of a very long chapter. She began her speech exactly as planned, speaking about the years nobody saw, the doubt she carried and refused to let win. She was midway through a sentence about partnership, about the people who stand beside you long before anyone claps for you, when Daniel stepped toward the stage from the side entrance, microphone already in hand, and the room's attention shifted before Margaret even understood what was happening. What he said next unfolded over roughly 90 seconds, though everyone in that room would later describe it as feeling far longer. He acknowledged Ethan by name in front of the cameras, in front of the people Margaret had spent decades building trust with. He explained in careful, rehearsed language that Ethan was his son, that the boy had been kept from public knowledge for 18 years, and that given everything Margaret had built during those same 18 years, he believed it was only fair that Ethan inherit half of it. The room did not erupt into noise. It did something quieter and more unsettling. It went still, the particular stillness of several hundred people simultaneously realizing they are witnessing something they were never meant to see. By the following morning, the footage had already traveled far beyond the room it was recorded in. Clips of Margaret's frozen expressions circulated endlessly, paired with captions that rarely captured what she was actually feeling in that moment, only what she appeared to be feeling from the outside. Reporters who had spent years covering her rise now camped outside her company's headquarters asking questions her legal team had explicitly instructed her not to answer. Her board of directors called an emergency meeting within 18 hours, less concerned with her marriage and more concerned with what the sudden headlines might do to investor confidence heading into a planned expansion. Margaret's legal team moved quickly to review the marriage's prenuptial agreement, a document drafted years before the company reached even a fraction of its current value. The immediate legal reality was far less dramatic than the version spreading across social media, but that distinction rarely survives contact with a news cycle hungry for a simpler story. Meanwhile, three competing theories took hold almost simultaneously. One suggested Margaret had known about Ethan for years and allowed the secret to continue for reasons of her own. Another suggested Vanessa had orchestrated the timing deliberately, using the ceremony as leverage. A third, quieter theory, one that would eventually prove closer to the truth, suggested Daniel was not acting entirely alone, and that someone outside the family had reasons to want Margaret publicly destabilized at exactly this moment. A former assistant of Margaret's, speaking only on condition of anonymity, described a woman who spent the days following the ceremony almost entirely in silence, reviewing documents late into the night rather than speaking to reporters or even close friends. A family acquaintance offered a different account, describing tension between Margaret and Daniel that had existed quietly for years, tension nobody outside the household had taken seriously enough to ask questions about. Ethan, meanwhile, retreated from public attention almost entirely, staying with his mother as legal representatives on all sides began exchanging documents that would eventually determine what, if anything, he was actually entitled to. Investigators looking into the timing of the announcement soon discovered something that complicated the story further. Weeks before the ceremony, a rival investor with a long-standing interest in acquiring a controlling stake in Margaret's company had reportedly made contact with Daniel, aware of his resentment and aware that a public scandal, timed correctly, could shake investor confidence enough to make an acquisition significantly easier. Whether Daniel fully understood he was being used as a tool in someone else's larger plan, or whether he believed the timing was entirely his own decision, remained, for weeks, one of the central unanswered questions of the entire story. The truth, once it surfaced, did not arrive through a dramatic confession. It arrived through documents, quietly subpoenaed as part of the legal proceedings surrounding the inheritance dispute. Financial records showed a pattern of communication between Daniel and the rival investor stretching back nearly 4 months before the ceremony, including a signed side agreement promising Daniel a significant personal payout if Margaret's company suffered a public scandal severe enough to affect its valuation ahead of a planned merger. Daniel had not simply revealed Ethan out of long-buried resentment. He had been offered a financial incentive to do it at the most damaging possible moment, and he had accepted. Ethan, upon learning this, described feeling as though he had been used twice in the same evening, once by a father who introduced him to the world only as leverage, and once by a stranger he had never met who had quietly funded the entire plan. The revelation shifted public sympathy considerably. Where headlines had once framed Margaret as a woman blindsided by her own family, they now framed Daniel as a man who had allowed himself to become a pawn in a corporate rivalry far larger than his personal grievances. The rival investor's involvement became its own smaller scandal, prompting an internal review at his firm and a wave of scrutiny into similar tactics used in other high-profile acquisitions. In a private meeting away from any cameras, arranged quietly by Margaret's legal team, Margaret and Ethan met for the first time. Accounts of that meeting remain limited, since neither participant chose to make its details public, but people close to Margaret described her demeanor afterward as noticeably different, calmer in a way that suggested the meeting had resolved something the headlines never could. In the months that followed, Margaret made a decision that surprised almost everyone who had followed the story since that night at the ceremony. Rather than pursuing Ethan through the same legal channels used against Daniel, she offered him a position within her company's foundation, explicitly separate from any inheritance claim tied to his father's demand. It was not charity, and she made that distinction clear in the limited public statement her office eventually released. It was an opportunity extended on the basis of what Ethan showed her directly, not on the basis of blood or the manner in which his existence had been revealed to her. Daniel's outcome unfolded very differently. The revelation of his agreement with the rival investor effectively ended any sympathy his public reveal might have generated, and he faced both a lawsuit from the investor's firm, which claimed he failed to deliver the outcome promised in their agreement, and the quiet, permanent unraveling of the marriage that had supported him for over 2 decades. Vanessa Cole, largely absent from the public narrative throughout the aftermath, chose to keep her own account of the story private, stating only that she wished her son had never been placed at the center of it. What remains long after the headlines faded is a question this story never fully answers for you, because it was never meant to. Margaret built something no one could take from her by force. Daniel tried to take half of it in front of the entire world, believing exposure alone could win him what 20 years of quiet resentment never gave him, and instead he lost nearly everything that remained. Whether that outcome constitutes justice, or simply the natural conclusion of a plan built on someone else's leverage, is something worth sitting with. Would you have forgiven him, or would you have walked away the moment the microphone was still warm in his hand? If the story affected you the way it affected so many people who lived through it in real time, let us know in the comments what you would have done in Margaret's position, faced with a truth that took 18 years to surface in front of an audience she never expected to become part of the story itself. And if you found this account gripping, wait until you hear what happened in our next story, one that begins with a quiet inheritance dispute and ends somewhere none of the people involved ever expected. Subscribe now so you never miss the next chapter of real-life power, betrayal, and the moments that redefine what family actually means.